schedule at this time the day the verdict is read.
I thought it said today. I wanted to end it on camera, but I couldn't get your attention. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, okay. I wanted, like, so next time, can we end it on camera?
Whatever you want, just let me know.
Like how? Yeah. I thought it just said there was one planned for today.
There is now, since there's
Yeah.
a verdict. Need this for a while. What are we supposed to read? You have room in your backpack there?
Oh, we got a lot of shit in there already. Gas masks and stuff.
I'm gonna do the same thing, so I'm gonna talk a little and I'm gonna get out. But I'm gonna try to come back at the end. Thank you for watching.
Also had elements of the city covering it up because that videotape was sat on with a payout to the family. Looking at that particular case, when the guilty verdict came down, no one busted up the town. The demonstrations were much more violent, much more destructive, a lot more vandalism involved prior to a verdict. So if you're trying to forecast what will happen in the future, there's plenty of passion, particularly following the shooting of Daunte Wright. So no shortage on passion. I anticipate before this verdict is read or shortly after, we're going to start seeing the bodies show up here. But in terms of what will happen, the answer would really depend on what that verdict is. All we know right now is that the verdict is in after 10 and a half hours of deliberations, and it's unanimous. We just don't see a lot of people out here on the street, Neil, but we're watching it.
You know, Mike, I guess there are a couple of thousand, up to 3,000 guardsmen helping with the police for any possible event later today, tonight. Do you see them around? What do you see?
You certainly do. You hear people talk about a war zone. It has a feel a lot like the green zone, complete with all of the concrete barriers all over the place. You see the guard vehicles standing sentry on different street corners, and they move them around from time to time. We've also got the information that there's such a need for personnel out here that they're bringing in law enforcement from outside of the state. Speaking of outside of the state, some of the demonstrators who were picked up, particularly in Brooklyn Center, have been from out of state and have been from out of town. A source tells me they're picking up people from Chicago, from Wisconsin, from Florida. What is absent right now is intelligence that some of these people are being brought in by organized groups. You do have a lot of communication. You do have people coming in from out of state, but what we're hearing through law enforcement sources, through the official channels with Operation Safety Net, is there is no organized group bringing people in from out of state. You do have a lot of people who are showing up, simply coming under their on their own dime and under their own power, because you have so much communication, so much interest, and so much passion in the following of these police-involved shootings, Neil.
All right, Mike Tobin, thank you for that update. In the meantime, just to let you know, we were obviously waiting for the verdict to be announced in about 15, 17 minutes or so, thereabouts. We should stress as well that the president has weighed in on this matter. He called the family of George Floyd, spoke to George Floyd's brother after the jury was sequestered. That is to offer his prayers, he said. They're calling for peace and tranquility no matter what the verdict is. This is coming from the president earlier today, and I am praying that the verdict is the right verdict. Lawrence Jones, Fox News analyst, what did you make of the president's involvement and weighing in on this? He wanted to stipulate, as did his press spokesman, that he was doing this as the jury was already sequestered. Your thoughts?
I think it's problematic on several fronts, considering that the judge had just came out and said, look, listen, respect the co-equal branch. Don't get involved. I think calling the family is one thing, but going out there publicly and making a statement, no matter how you feel about it, interrupts the process and it only gives the defense more ammo for an objection and appeal that they're going to make eventually. No matter how this goes, they're going to make some sort of appeal unless he is found totally innocent on all counts, and I just don't see that happening. Look, I think it is hard in these moments because you have to check yourself, your emotions as a human being. And trust me, as I said earlier on TV, it's hard for me being an analyst with my experience as a private investigator and just being a TV guy covering politics of the day, sticking to the facts of the case and not feeling what I felt when I saw the video itself. So if I can do it, the President of the United States can do it as well.
You know, Lawrence, it's interesting, too. We talked a lot about Maxine Waters' comments, whether it stirred the pot, but we do know Judge Cale had said they were not helpful remarks, saying, I'll give you that Congresswoman Waters may have given you something, speaking to the defense attorney, on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned. Now, obviously, it would depend on which of these charges come through with guilty verdicts. We just don't know at this point. But that involvement has raised a host of concerns about the ultimate outcome of all of this, no matter what we find out today, right?
Right, it's muddied the waters a lot. Now, I don't think that alone will give the defense a mistrial. And remember, Neil, most of my time, I've never been on the prosecution side as an investigator. It's always been on the defense side. I don't think it's enough to give them sort of mistrial, but, you know, I'm sure they will present that case. But what it did is it complicated things. I think it's important to go back to why this has become so problematic. Early on, the judge issued a gag order not only to the defense, but he issued a gag order to the prosecution and elected officials in general. He said, I don't want you doing any talking at all because it could prejudice the jury. He later rescinded that gag order after the media started to bring up a lawsuit because they said that it wasn't being transparent. They couldn't do their job. And the defense made the argument that there was certain prejudice toward them because the prosecution as well as elected officials had already been talking publicly, so they wanted a fair shot, so he got rid of it in general. So this is a judge that has tried his hardest to keep this as a fair trial, and he even said from the beginning that his gag order did not work to begin with because once he implemented, people started to leak from both sides, and he was afraid that it may hurt the jury pool. So again, you know, the comments of Maxine Waters, the reason why she was there, many activists say, is because a lot of the local officials weren't talking. The reason why they weren't talking is because the judge told him not to talk because it would hurt the process. And so I think it's problematic that you have a California congresswoman that is not going to be able to or have to deal with the repercussions of a city being in flames. She gets to go back to California or D.C. It is that community, many black and brown businesses that are going to have to deal with the anxiety, their businesses being burned down, and mending the community back together after such a tragic case.
Lawrence Jones, if you can hang around, my friend, I want to bring back Andy McCarthy, the former assistant U.S. attorney. Andy, I'm just wondering why the jurors weren't sequestered from the beginning throughout the entire trial. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, Neil, jury service is very hard, and you don't want to take people away from their families for weeks if you can avoid it. The general rule in the road in most states is that they are sequestered once deliberations start, but not at the start of a trial. And, you know, they have to be sensitive to the idea of who's going to want to be on jury service if you think that they're not only going to make you come to court every day, but they're going to keep you there for however long. So, you know, they try to walk the line between protecting the process and not making jury service too arduous. I think the big mistake that got made here, and I think Judge Cahill, by the way, tried an excellent case, but I think in the wake of the Brooklyn Center shooting last week, he should have sequestered the jury right there and then, because they were at the very tail end of the evidence. He didn't need to give everybody Friday off. They didn't need to take the weekend off. He could have gone right into summations and deliberations and kept them sequestered and as insulated as you could from the news. Instead, he let them go home and kind of marinate in this terrible atmosphere in Minnesota or Minneapolis over the weekend. I think that was a mistake.
And it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback on my part, but it does set the stage for what those jurors would be exposed to, including obviously the Maxine Waters comments and even the president's comments, even though they were sequestered by that time. But it did allow Judge Cahill to say of these outside interferences, I wish elected officials would stop talking about the case, especially in a matter that is disrespectful to the rule of law. I guess what I'm asking you is whether something like this, it really depends on what the ultimate verdict is, allows the defense to argue. They wanted this case thrown out at a number of times throughout this process, if memory serves me right, Andy, to come back to that if the verdict is not to their liking.
Neil, I think this is as strong a case as I've ever seen for prejudicial publicity. And the thing that you have to remember with Maxine Waters' statements and President Biden's statements is that they're not one-offs, they're not in isolation, they come in a context. Here we have a situation where the defendant, for good reason, argued that he could not get a fair trial in Hennepin County given what the atmosphere was there. While the jury was being selected, the city of Minneapolis, which owed Chauvin a fair trial, it's their obligation to give him the fair trial, they picked that time while the jury was in the while the judge was in the middle of selecting the jury to announce publicly that they had made a $27 million settlement with the Floyd family. And then you have, going forward, what we just discussed now, what happened in Brooklyn Center, and the defense lawyer came in and said, Judge, if at this point, if we don't sequester them, the amount of publicity that they are going to be exposed to and the amount of unrest in the streets that they are going to be exposed to, under circumstances where one of the jurors was actually from Brooklyn Center and a number of the jurors had ties to the area, and then you lop on top of that the kind of explosive statements that were made by Congresswoman Waters and then the president piling on today, I think that makes a very strong record. And as I said to you a few minutes ago, it becomes all the stronger if it looks like, without even taking a full day and without even sending a note to the court, the jury convicted on all 3 counts, if that's what happens.
All right, Andy, thank you. Don't go too far, my friend. I want to bring Leo Terrell into this, a Fox News contributor, much more. But Leo, the relatively short time it took to make this decision, the no question part, all of that, what does it tell you?
Well, I'll tell you, Neil, thanks for, first of all, having me on. The no questions from the jurors tell you that they came to a quick conclusion and the defendant is in trouble. Normally, if there's some questions, some type of disagreement, you're going to ask questions for additional evidence. So that tells me it's not a good sign for the defendant. Also, the fact that what probably happened, Neil, was that they probably, after they selected the 4-person, they took a initial vote. And probably there was no disagreements. And they waited and also went through each of the 3 charges. And that explains the 22, 23 hours from the closing arguments up until where we are right now. So I think the only option for the defendant is a series of appeals.
So let me ask you this. All the defense had to do was plant, some reasonable doubt in the mind of at least one of these jurors. Is it your gut, with all these dynamics at play and the short nature of this? They started last night, they started this morning at 8:30, and here they have a decision, a verdict. Is it your sense that that was an uphill climb?
Let me think about that. Yes. And I'll tell you why, Neil. You can justify a certain amount of force, but when George Floyd had no pulse and no resistance, it went from necessary force to excessive force. And I guarantee you, if you talk to those 12 jurors, they will tell you they could not probably understand why Chauvin had his knee on Floyd's neck when he wasn't resistant. Don't forget, he was handcuffed as well.
If you think about it as well, Leo, there was video of this from lots of people, not just, the official police video, but so many other sources from so many other angles, playing it again and again and again, only heightens people's, condemnation of this event, whether fairly or not, to the former officer. I'm wondering how technology played into this and the damning nature of it.
Well, let me mention 2 things. I think the video was outrageous. It was horrific. The whole world saw it. But let me also point out to you, Neil, when you were a young pup, the Rodney King case, the first trial, there was a video that went worldwide before social media. And those officers were not found guilty the first trial. But I think what you saw there in the George Floyd video, unlike the Rodney King case, you saw no resistance. And you saw a man handcuffed on the ground. And I will submit to you, Neil, that those, as I mentioned, those 3.5, 4 minutes in which he was not resisting could not be justified or explained. The jury could not accept any explanation from the defense. George Floyd resisted initially, But there was a period in time that George Floyd did not resist. And I would also submit to you, Neil, that if George Floyd was not under the knee of Derek Chauvin, he would be alive today.
So what are we to learn from this? Obviously, we don't know until the verdict, is announced. But obviously, they're worried. They have 3,000 National Guard troops in Minneapolis as we speak to help the police in case anything happens. But much would depend on the charge or charges on which Officer is found guilty or not. Now, is it your sense that a manslaughter charge would trigger still a very significant protest tonight?
Neil, if you look at Maxine Waters, she wants a charge that does not even exist to be placed upon this officer, first-degree murder. What I'm hoping for is that if there is a second-degree murder conviction, there will be peace in this country. Unfortunately, Neil, this case has been politicized by the president, by Maxine Waters, and so I would submit to you that nothing is going to please them at all because there's politics in play here. The judge tried to make it clear that we're a nation of laws and the court of public opinion should be kept separate, but there's a political impact of this case. I'm hoping for a second-degree murder. Well, let me rephrase. If there is a second-degree murder charge or conviction, hopefully there should be peace. There should be justification. There should be that the system worked. It's not a racist system. But I don't know because, again, there are people, unfortunately, who profit from chaos.
All right, so that second-degree murder charge is based on the idea that Chauvin intentionally did this, right? That he committed an assault which caused, unintentionally or not, Floyd's death. Now, that one, that's a big one because that could land in the prison for the rest of his life, up to 40 years. How likely is that?
Very unlikely because the court will take a that's the maximum. The second degree is 40 years, the third degree is 25 years, and the manslaughter is 10 years. Those are the maximum sentences. So, you look at his history, he's not a lifetime criminal. So the question here is, what will be the appropriate sentence? There'll be a report being done by parole and probation, and there'll be aggravating and mitigating circumstances, and then there'll be a sentence imposed. But that's the maximum. And I don't think he's going to get the 40-year maximum sentence if he's convicted of second degree.
Okay.
No, I'm done. Thank you.
The argument, Leo, that the prosecutors made was believe your eyes, believe these videos, believe all of these angles from all of these folks who recorded this horrific event. You can believe your eyes. You can believe your gut. That was essentially their entire argument. What did you make of that?
I think that was a very good and powerful argument. Of course, Neil, we have a history of in this country where it's difficult, very difficult to convict a police officer. Why? Because police officers have an inherent positive feeling among Americans. They protect us 24/7. They protect you and I at 2 a.m. And it's hard for the public to find a police officer who might be a criminal in certain acts. There are 97, in my opinion, and I did civil rights cases for over 30 years, 97 and 98% of officers are great, Neil. 1 or 2% are rotten to the core. It's hard to get that 1 or 2% out of the system. Tim Scott had a bill last year. It was filibustered again by Democrats. So there's a video that was very, very important, and I think that the prosecution made a key point, Neil. This was a case against Derek Chauvin, not Minnesota Police Department. So they did a great job of separating law enforcement from this particular bad apple. And I think that's why the jury had no problem going after this bad apple and yet respecting the integrity of law enforcement.
Leo, thank you very, very much. Don't wander too far, my friend. Leo Terrell on
I'm going to wander.
Again,
can I get a sandwich? Can I get a sandwich?
No, you can do that, but you better grab it fast. Leo Terrell with us right now. This is the time at which we were told a verdict would be read beginning around now in court between 4:30 p.m. And about 5 p.m., a jury has reached a verdict, for those of you just tuning into the trial of that former Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin. He's charged in the murder of George Floyd. Mark Eiglash joins us right now. Eiglash, I should say, I apologize, criminal defense attorney in Florida. Mark, much has been made, as I've raised with other guests, the relatively quick nature of this. Others have argued, not too quick, because the jurors have been captivated for the better part of, 2.5 weeks. So maybe they had all their questions and unknowns addressed during that time. And this was a fairly direct issue. How do you see the period of time from the meeting a few hours yesterday to coming in 8:30 this morning and reaching a decision by now?
I don't consider it a quick verdict. Look, they started off with the presumption of innocence. The minute the prosecutors hit play, and they watched for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and they are human just like all of us. They got the same feeling that we did when we watched that video. The presumption of innocence then went out the window. At that point, it didn't matter what was said. They knew that that behavior was not reasonable. It could not be justified. And I believe at that point, the rest that the defense did, some of it may be true. Yeah, there were other causes or whatever. But the substantial cause of death was the knee on his neck for that prolonged period of time. They knew it.
And that the prosecution was very effective at playing that for its full duration, to share its impact, to say nothing of other videos from other angles, from scores of other folks that kind of told this story again and again and again. What did you think of that?
I thought the prosecutor did a very effective job, all of them, in proving that, guys, we've got the crime on video. Yeah, all that other stuff showed Floyd resisting. It showed him engaging in bizarre behavior. But ultimately, when he's in the care, custody, and control of Shovin, and Shovin would not remove his knee, that was a crime. And by the way, the prosecution touched on one point. I would have hammered it even more. He touched on ego. Ego. Chauvin's ego was not his amigo. And when they yelled, "Get off of his neck, get off of him," Chauvin's ego said, "I'm not going anywhere." And I think that's what played a role in his actions.
When you look at this, Mark, and the information that we have, the defense tried to show prior instances of Floyd where he was arrested, where he seemed to be out of it, either heavily intoxicated or on drugs, to show a pattern of behavior that was problematic and would test his medical condition. Do you think that registered in any way?
No. I think that it was effective because when you're the defense lawyer, you've got to do everything you can with what you have. So you bring in all those things, an enlarged heart, narrow arteries, any other problems, the exhaust, his drug use, all of that's relevant. And good job, defense, for bringing that up. That said, the jurors said, I think, and again, we're waiting for the verdict and anything's possible, I think they said, okay, those might have been factors, but all we have to find is that the actions of Chauvin were a substantial cause. And that, I think, is what they decided.
Let me ask you about the defense lawyer, Eric Nelson, who, did not let up on criticizing Maxine Waters' comments on this, incendiary comments that even prompted the judge to agree to the extent that it might reverse or try to, mitigate, if not, eliminate this trial decision, to overturn it, so to speak. What did you think of that?
I think those are very fair comments for the defense lawyer to make. Look, I've been trying cases for 28 years, and we have a tough enough time relying upon the evidence and only the evidence, which is what the jurors are instructed to rely upon. These external forces are extraordinary, and they're problematic. I have a case down here in South Florida where our former president commented about my client without knowing all of the evidence. That stuff definitely interferes with the process. Now, they have every right. First Amendment affords them wide latitude to spew whatever words they want. But they need to know that they are intentionally or possibly indirectly interfering with the jury's function, which is solely to decide the case based upon the evidence exclusively.
So, Mark, you do me a favor. is it your sense now that the people gathering in the courtroom, what is going on in there as we await this decision? Who has to be there? Who has to be seated, in that room before we can proceed?
You've got to have the defendant present. You've got to have lots of security. They always bring in the security. You definitely need the prosecutors. I can assure you that that is the most challenging moment for a litigator. I mean, you work for years on this case. The butterflies are there. I assure you they are very anxious because the outcome of this case will have a huge impact on everyone's life in that courtroom.
All right, now we see the crowds gathering outside this Minneapolis courthouse here. For the judge, what is his role today? When we hear this verdict, he obviously doesn't make a decision immediately on sentencing, or could he?
No, he will not make a decision on sentencing today. The prosecutors have already indicated they are seeking an enhanced penalty. That should happen at a different time, at a different date, because then the focus becomes mitigation, why the sentence should be less than the prosecutors are seeking, and the defense needs time to develop that. The judge's function today is to ensure that the verdict was unanimously decided by the jurors and that whatever they decide reflects the group as a whole and not just one or two people on the jury.
All right, Mark Aguilar, thank you very much. Criminal defense attorney. Don't wander too far yourself. I appreciate your expertise. Also want to bring Jonathan Turley into this. Jonathan, you, like many of us, now are waiting this verdict of the trial of Derek Chauvin, of course, the ex-policeman charged in the killing of George Floyd. Now, these various charges from second-degree murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter, does the judge have wide discretion on actual sentencing? Where is he granted the most flexibility?
Well, there is a range here, but it's really the upper range that is the focus of the defense. Those murder charges means that he is likely to spend the rest of his life in jail. Manslaughter gives him the chance of getting out and having a life. It's that simple. The upper end of the murder range, where you would likely find a sentence in this case, is effectively his life sentence. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I run an older prisoner project. People age faster in prison. The type of sentence you get on a murder charge is often an effective life sentence. Now, we can't really assume that there is a conviction here, but the fact is, I can tell you as a criminal defense attorney, I would loathe to get a call this early. I do think this is an early call. I disagree with the earlier attorney. I did not expect a decision this quickly because you have three different charges, a great deal of evidence that's been produced in this case. And there is some really sort of interstitial issues as to what's the burden, what are the different standards. So what we're going to be looking for is, did the jury just go in and decide this is really the big ticket item? This is murder, second-degree murder. Once you make that decision, the night is over. Or did they go in and just say, look, none of us or a few of us believe this is a true murder case, but we all seem to be gathering around manslaughter. I personally view this more as a manslaughter case. But we'll see that, obviously, when the verdict comes out. For the defense, they did their very best. But I must tell you, as a defense attorney, really fighting a videotape of this impact and this emotive sort of weight is very difficult. People are visual. We are a visual species. You can't unsee something this traumatic. And so Mr. Nelson did a very good job. The question that always haunts a defense attorney is, should you have just put him on the stand? And I think that the defense here was really pursuing a hung jury strategy, that they were hoping to maybe get an acquittal on one or both of the murder charges and then get a hung jury on manslaughter. Having a fast turnaround like this means you may have undershot by a long degree.
All right, we just won't know. We will know soon. We're about 10 minutes into the period, the rough half-hour period, 4:30 p.m. Eastern time to 5 p.m., in which the verdict was to be announced. We don't know exactly what's going on in the court, but as you can see outside the court, crowds have been building and quite dramatically. Mike Tobin is out there right now. Mike, what are you seeing?
We need at least something.
Well, I'm seeing this big crowd that formed up on the south side of the courthouse, and as you mentioned, they built up rather rapidly as the word started getting out. As far as this, and I've been talking to people here in the crowd as far as what will satisfy them with the verdict. And frankly, I'm getting a lot of different answers. Some people say what they want is justice. Some people say it's in Jesus' hands. Some people say that they will only be satisfied if they get 3 guilty verdicts on the 3 different criminal counts here. But some say they're willing to compromise, and 2 out of 3 ain't bad, to coin a term. So no shortage on passion here. So much has been involved in this case, so much impact to this town, and then so much gasoline has been thrown on the fire. And you talk about this case, you have some people who want to talk about the Daunte Wright case, because it's all kind of blended together with this idea that there's this callous indifference toward black lives at the hands of the police. And that's what we see out here, such a tremendous amount of passion, and also gasoline thrown on the fire in terms of the political leaders who came out here. And you heard the judge say that he was a little upset that the legislative branch was crossing over into the judicial branch and making their comments here, and he wished that the legislator, in this case the executive branch, would just be quiet about it. You saw the president chimed in today saying that the evidence is overwhelming and there should only be a guilty verdict. And if the crowd hears that and it's backed up by the leader of the free world and they get a different verdict, there's going to be a conflict. And right now you've got a lot of passion, you've got a lot of anticipation, and any minute now we'll hear what the jury has decided, Neil.
You know, Mike, obviously you were telling me a little earlier that the guardsmen are there, up to 3,000 of them, to support local police if things get out of hand. But even if they don't, right now it looks like, I think you were mentioning before, that they're there, people can see them there, but they're not in anyone's face. Do you know how this, obviously the verdict will go a long way to decide how they emerge and what they do. But if it were down to just a manslaughter charge, that might ignite some fury there. So do you know what they're prepared for?
Well, what you know that the police forces are prepared for, the Operation Safety Net, as it were, what they're prepared for is to respond with as much manpower as they can muster. So much manpower that they have now reached out to police forces outside of the state and brought in agencies like the Ohio Highway Patrol to come in here and bolster the manpower that's already supplemented by the National Guard. So they're anticipating that this could be trouble. The rarity here in Minneapolis is to go into a restaurant that is not boarded up. So the retail establishments are all bracing for it. And that being said, when you start talking with the business owners out here, none of them want to have this impact. None of them want to have their stores looted, in some cases looted again. But they are very sympathetic, by and large, with those whom I spoke, to the passion of this crowd. There isn't really anyone who can look at the videotape that we have now all seen and who's not been horrified by it. So what you have is that overwhelming piece of evidence that was key, really central in this trial. And if the verdict doesn't agree what the people have seen on that videotape, you can anticipate there's going to be a very negative reaction, and it will probably manifest itself into certainly passionate people out in the street, probably destruction. And that's what law enforcement is bracing for, Neil.
All right, Mike, thank you very, very much. Just laying out the scene here and what you're looking at outside the Minneapolis courthouse, where moments from now we are expected to be read the verdict from the jury on the trial of Derek Chauvin. Of course, he's accused of killing George Floyd, an unarmed black man kneeling on his neck for the better part of 9+ minutes. One of the first things the prosecution did is play that entire tape for the better part of 9+ minutes so the jurors could let that sink in. And a number of top legal eagles on all sides have said that that was very powerful, very, very effective. We should say that the jurors themselves had to consider a variety of potential punishments here in the event they found him guilty of anything, including a number of charges from third-degree murder to second-degree manslaughter, second-degree murder, each carrying various potential jail times. In the case of manslaughter, up to 10 years. If you go to the far more significant development of second-degree murder, up to 40 years. And not that those extreme jail times often come to pass, but again, that depends if he is found guilty on any one of those. It's a possibility he's not, although people have read into the fact that the jury was sequestered for such a short time, briefly yesterday, a few hours into the evening, and again coming in at 8:30 this morning, and then making a decision that was announced a little bit more than an hour ago. Right now, back with Lawrence Jones. Lawrence, that crowd is waiting for some closure here. I wouldn't say to a man or woman that they want to see severe punishment meted out, but they want a guilty verdict. And I'm just wondering if a guilty verdict just on the manslaughter count will not be enough for them. Your thoughts?
I don't know what will be enough. You know, Neil, it's interesting because this is probably the first time of one of these major cases where I've been in the studio and not out there reporting from where the people are. And it is the same thing that happens every single time. People are emotional, they're reactive. Many times the family is somewhere in their home, and then they reemerge once the verdict has been read to be with the people that are outside that have been supporting their movement. And so these are difficult situations. It is very hard to secure these events. I'll never forget when I was in Ferguson, when shots started to ring out against the National Guard and the police that were there, where they essentially burnt down a city that night. So this is a difficult situation. I think that, you know, none of us know what the jury is gonna say today. But it is very telling that there was no questions asked. And the fact is, I think the most compelling part of the case is not just the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, which they said almost 17 times just in their closing argument. I'm sorry, 7 times, over 7 times. It was the fact that they talked about when the pulse was there and when it was no longer there, that additional 2 minutes that he still was on the neck. That is going to be very hard to get out of the minds of the jury. And I can't help but, most of my time as a private investigator was only with the defense, but I can't help but question the strategy when the defense attorney Nelson said yesterday, well, jury, you know, if he's talking, then he's breathing. But it almost begs the question, when Mr. Floyd stopped talking, then you had to have known that he was no longer breathing. When they checked the pulse and there was no pulse, you had to have known that he wasn't breathing. And I think that alone is going to be hard to square. Not only that, the fact that they said this was not an anti-police prosecution, but it was a pro-police. Remember, going in already, the prosecution is at a deficit, even with the video, because how Americans view the police. This is why they had a very strategic way of handling it. They did not talk about race. They talked about the fact that this was a lone wolf, essentially, that he was one of the bad ones, that this is a noble profession. They made the point to say that this is a pro-police prosecution. And not only that, when it comes to the use of force, they decided to bring in numerous amount of experts, all the way from the police chief, who, by the way, had already sued the police department before for racism. They did not bring that up in their prosecution. They decided to stick with, this is what the profession is, this is what the profession should be, and this guy essentially was on a power trip. And in the closing statement, they talked about that even when you had a member of law enforcement, one of the bad ones, essentially, they were alluding to, with the knee on the neck, that the citizens that were surrounding the area still called the police because they still had faith in the police. They wanted to make it very clear that they were pro-police and that this guy was a lone wolf. That was very telling to me.
Yeah, also telling, if you think about it, Lawrence, was how Chauvin was abandoned by a lot of his fellow police officers and his immediate superiors in this, not across the board, but that they had seen that this was exceptionally brutal, and they distinguished it from other actions that would be more acceptable. I'm just wondering, that had to have hurt the defense, making the argument that these were trumped up or excessive charges for something that they deemed was not an excessive act. That we don't know. Once we get the verdict, we will. That didn't seem to resonate.
Well, what they did, Neil, which I think was hard, is that they relied they had some experts, but the majority of their defense relied on the policies and procedures that they tried to mince and say, you know, he was following policy, this is what the booklet says. But when you have the people that essentially wrote the policy that are there testifying for the prosecution, that makes it very hard. Now, also, this doesn't matter for as the trial, but outside, remember, Neil, this is one of the first time where you had police unions who normally stick with the blue line all across the country say, this is not us. The video was just too horrific, Neil. And so you saw, although there were some people that defended him, by and large, most police officers and most police officer unions said, no, this is not us. We condemn this because it was so egregious. So you're right. It was hard to get experts, police experts, on his side for this because it was a stain on the profession. And you know, they tried to, it was their job as the defense to show how hard the profession was, and the prosecution matched it by saying, yes, we know it's hard, and that's why we think that it is noble, and what you did dishonored the profession. And that was a brilliant back and forth strategy.
All right, thank you, my friend, very much. For those of you tuning at home, we are still waiting for the jury's decision. A verdict is in, we are told. Again, all of this goes back to the Derek Chauvin case, the officer involved in the death of George Floyd, facing 3 murder charges right now, or 3 charges to be more specific: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter. Now the jury could convict him of 1, 2, or all 3 of these, or none. Trace Gallagher, obviously this is taking, you know, a while to get everything set inside the courtroom as we watch these crowds build outside the courtroom. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, these always do, Neil. You got to get everybody the major players inside the courtroom. I just want to add, if I can, a little bit of context to the conversations you've been having. One with, Professor Jonathan Turley, who, of course, is brilliant, but he's saying that Derek Chauvin could likely spend the rest of his life in prison if he's convicted of either second or third degree murder. The research that we have done and the stories we have done in recent days show that's probably not accurate, because the 40-year sentence for the second degree murder, the 25-year sentence for third degree, and the 10-year sentence for the manslaughter, if you look in the history of Minneapolis in Minnesota and you look at the averages for even the second degree murder for 40 years, most of those inmates, the suspects, the people who are convicted, are only serving about 12 and a half years. Same goes for the third degree murder, serving an average of about 12 and a half years. Now, the prosecutors have said they will seek enhancements. Whether they get them, we have no idea. This is kind of up to the judge. But when you look at these possible sentences and the average time spent being 12 and a half years, that's because Derek Chauvin does not have any type of criminal past. And then you look at what people are actually serving. And in the state of Minnesota, people on average serve about 2/3 of their sentences. So then it kind of boils down to the fact you've got Derek Chauvin, who literally could be walking free in 8, 9, maybe 10 years, even if he is convicted on the most serious charge. And I think it's also important, Neil, to go back and remember that several months ago, Derek Chauvin was willing to plead guilty to third-degree murder. I mean, he was saying, look, I'm willing to plead guilty. He knew that would have entailed significant prison time, but the Attorney General then, Bill Barr, said no because it was one too early, and there was this kind of prospect that maybe a third-degree murder sentence was too lenient because the climate in the country was at such a heated rate. So that's one of those things. And you talk about what was important in the trial and what wasn't, Neil, and the seconds really were everything, because you look back and you think that 8 minutes and 46 seconds became a symbol for George Floyd. It was a clarion call to those who protested in the streets. And then you have the prosecutor go in on day one and show this video, and the video actually ticks up to 9 minutes, 29 seconds. Those 43 seconds in that courtroom were everything. And you knew when the defense was looking at that and looking at the clock that was a significant difference in what people thought. And the extra 43 seconds did not help Derek Chauvin one bit. They deliberated for 10.5 hours, Neil. You have different, legal experts saying, well, that's a short verdict. It's a long verdict. All the trials that we've covered here on Fox News Channel, going back to O.J. Simpson, to Scott Peterson, to Michael Jackson, to Timothy McVeigh, a quick verdict, except in O.J. Simpson, is very bad news for the defendant. And I think that a lot of defense attorneys that we have talked to over the last several days and weeks would concur with the fact that this does not appear to bode well for Derek Chauvin, who, by the way, is 44 years old, and if convicted on all of these things, unless the sentences run concurrent, it's one after the other, then you're talking about the fact that he could walk out in 8, 9, 10 years, Neil.
Amazing. And I'd forgotten about his willingness to go ahead and agree to third-degree murder charges back at the beginning of all of this. Trace, thank you very much. Mercedes Conlon joins us on the phone right now. Mercedes, what do you read into this, the quick nature of this, and all the other things you've been hearing leading up to this verdict that we're supposed to hear any minute now?
Most defense attorneys will tell you, Neil, that if you've got a quick turnaround when the jury is deliberating, it is not good news for the defense. So a lot of defense, and you can see that from a lot of defense attorneys that are having the same reaction, that this does not bode well. And certainly, Trace is exactly right. Those 9-minute and 29-second video was absolutely devastating. And the defense did all they could to try to get around that video. They kept saying, don't focus on those 9 minutes and 29 seconds. There are 150,000 pages of evidence. There are lots of investigators involved. There was a lot that took place before the 9 minutes and 29 seconds came to be. But frankly, it's what the prosecutor said, and it resonates with this jury. Believe your eyes. See with your eyes. What you see is exactly what took place, the fact that Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. And it resonated. We'll have to see what happens with the verdict. But as a defense attorney, I think most defense attorneys will tell you that this was a very quick turnaround and does not bode well.
Mercedes, you only have about a minute, but your thoughts on that video, the significance of that video, because it wasn't just one video, but played on countless devices and smartphones, dozens of which were played and replayed from virtually every angle in that courtroom. Powerful for the prosecution. What do you think?
And it's what we deal with now in the advent of all these changes with our personal devices that can capture evidence in real time. This type of evidence is going to be with us for in infinitum. This is the type of evidence that you have to overcome, and it's extremely difficult to do so. And look, you and I watched that video. We know it was absolutely devastating. It dominated the news. Everyone I've spoken to, this is something that they watched, gut-wrenching. And for the jury to sit there and see it again, and certainly even when the defense tried to play certain parts of the video, it wasn't helpful at all. And you kept hearing, of course, George Floyd asking, but just saying that he couldn't breathe over and over again 27 times. So it resonates. And we'll have to see what the jury decides.
All right. Thank you, Mercedes Conlon. And it indeed became an iconic metaphor that many in the black community have used to say everyone has had their neck on African Americans. This proves.
Good afternoon from Fox News in Washington. I'm Mike Emanuel. We have a verdict in the high-profile trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. The jury deliberating for 13 hours, announcing it has a verdict in this very high-profile case. Chauvin is facing 3 charges related to the death of George Floyd last year: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter. The judge is Peter Cahill. Defense attorney Eric Nelson did his best to try to poke holes in the prosecution's argument, trying to say that basically Officer Chauvin was acting in a responsible way. Fox News correspondent Caroline Shively joins me live from outside the Minneapolis courthouse. Caroline, what's the scene there?
The crowd has grown rapidly. There are folks here talking into a PA system. You see the signs, convict Chauvin, police the police. This is a very fired up crowd, but a very peaceable crowd so far. They all want to know the very big question, these counts that you just went through, how will this go down? How will the verdicts come in for Derek Chauvin, who is now accused of killing George Floyd last year on May 25th?
Caroline, we heard about 90 minutes ago from the court that there was a verdict. Can you describe the stepped-up security in that time, obviously giving law enforcement an opportunity to get in position to try to keep a handle on things, I imagine?
Absolutely, Mike. I'm going to take a slow turn this way with my photographer, Phil. You'll see the crowd. This crowd wasn't here when we were down here an hour. If you take a look up at the Henneman County Government Center, you can see the members of the National Guard, one of the 3,000 National Guard members who have been activated in and around Minneapolis. You also see some local police officers there. We have seen Humvees. We've seen troop carriers going through the streets of Minneapolis. It's too tight here probably to see the boarded up windows. Most of the businesses and government buildings in and around downtown have been boarded up. They have seen the violent protests, and just anticipating any potential violent protests, they have boarded up those windows. The government center, the security, you probably saw some of this fencing. We've been talking about that throughout the day, Mike. You're looking at a 12-foot tall fence. Another fence is right behind that. That is 8 feet long. If you go on the back side of the government center here, that is covered in razor wire in certain points. They are taking this very seriously. The security here, they saw what went down in Brooklyn Center a few miles down the road after the killing of Daunte Wright and the protest there. That is the last thing they want to happen. They've also gone to other governors in Ohio and Nebraska asking for some of their law enforcement to come help police this city. Law enforcement said they will use de-escalation techniques. They don't want to rough up any protesters, but things could get ugly here, Mike, depending on how this verdict goes down.
We know jurors have been sequestered, so presumably they are not aware of a lot of the coverage going on, but they certainly notice reporters scrutinizing them as they come and go from the courthouse. They undoubtedly realize there is a significant nature to this particular case. Bottom line, we wait to see what the jury has to say about this. We know the prosecution told the jurors to basically trust their eyes. Both sides used video from the George Floyd killing, and the prosecution emphasized trust your eyes, trust your judgment. Is that reasonable force? What about that, Caroline?
Sure, that is what he said over and over again. Believe your gut. He said what you have seen in this 9.5 minutes was not policing. This was murder. Going back to those 3 counts, you were talking about count 1, the second-degree unintentional murder. That is the one that could put Derek Chauvin, if convicted, behind bars for 40 years, probably more like 12.5 since he has a clean record. That the prosecution must prove Chauvin committed a felony assault in this case that led to the death of George Floyd. The next case is third-degree murder. That's the second count, also known as depraved mind murder. In that case, they would have to prove Chauvin caused Floyd's death in an act that was eminently dangerous. Basically, he should have known better. The lowest count is the manslaughter, second-degree manslaughter, that he had culpable negligence for causing the death of George Floyd. That could be punished by a maximum of 10 years.
Caroline?
More likely would be 4 years. Now, if he is convicted in this case,
Caroline?
the jury's job is not done. They will have to go back and decide if there were any aggravating circumstances. One could be, were there any children present? We know there was a 9-year-old child watching this entire time. That could boost up the sentencing in this case.
Caroline, great job out at the scene. We need to go inside the courtroom live. Judge Peter Cahill is in the chamber.
For the jury.
And let's listen.
Please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes. Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. Be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately, returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All right.
Thank you.
A Minneapolis jury finds former police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of third-degree murder, and guilty of second-degree manslaughter. So we await a reaction from outside the courthouse. Bottom line, a lot of folks across the country who watched that video of the death of George Floyd will undoubtedly be pleased by the jury's findings in this case. We await sentencing that week, 8 weeks from today, as we just heard from the judge. For full reaction and fallout from the Derek Chauvin trial, please stay with this local Fox station. I'm Mike Emanuel, Fox News. Good afternoon. And we are joining us live from Washington. I've got breaking coverage here, the Derek Chauvin trial. Let's go to our expert analyst on the scene, defense attorney Imran Ansari. Imran, are you there?
Tell them we're here if they want us. Tell them we're here if we want us.
We're looking outside the courthouse at correspondent Caroline Shively. There he is. Imran, can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you.
Okay, so your reaction to this verdict by the jury, any surprise?
I can't say that I am surprised because the prosecution really brought a case which connected all the dots between A, that Derek Chauvin's actions were not objectively reasonable under the law, and B, those actions caused George Floyd's death. We saw a litany of medical experts that came and testified during this trial and really put that prosecution case together. You also heard from police officers, and I always say that this trial will be historic because you see the crumbling of that classic blue wall of silence where officers would sort of protect their own. But that wasn't the case at this trial. We saw police officers, including the Minneapolis police chief, come in and give their stamp of disapproval in terms of what Derek Chauvin did. And now you have this unanimous verdict from the jury following this trial with lots of evidence. And it came quicker than I expected, I have to admit. I thought that it was going to be at least possibly towards the end of this week, but they came in with swift justice, if you will, and guilty on all counts.
Imran, a difficult case for a defense attorney. I mean, we all saw the video. The video was everywhere. Your thoughts on the case that the defense attorney, someone like you, had to deal with in this issue?
This was a tremendously difficult case for Eric Nelson to defend, and I think he did an excellent job under the circumstances. He was dealt the facts that he was given, the cards that he was dealt, and he did an excellent job with what he had. It was a tremendous uphill battle in terms of putting forth the defense when the prosecution had things like the videos. And the videos, which sparked outrage, polarized the nation when they were first released, resonated in the prosecution over and over again. And Eric Nelson had an uphill battle because he was also dealing with this public perception that was out there. It was put forward by the media. It was put forward by politicians. You had the police chief himself saying this was not a lack of training. It was murder. So you had the cards were stacked against the defense, and Eric Nelson did his job as a defense attorney for his client, and it's commendable because it's easy to represent perhaps or put forth a case when the facts are in your favor, but when there's facts that are not in your favor and you have to deal with that on the defense, that is the difficult job. And Eric Nelson had a tremendously difficult job, and he should be commended for his lawyering.
Imran, I noticed that both the prosecution and defense used video of this George Floyd encounter with Officer Derek Chauvin. Were you surprised that both sides tried to use the video and to help tell their story?
The video, there was no escaping it. We saw it from day one, even before this trial commenced, even before the real prosecution was underway. There was no escaping the video. And we knew that the video was going to play a prominent role in this case, both on the prosecution side, also on the defense side. And we saw both sides using that to sort of spin their own take on the case, their own theory of the case. You had the prosecution obviously trying to connect the dots with the video, both on the excessive force and the unreasonableness of that force by Derek Chauvin, along with the causation factors that we saw. And then, of course, Eric Nelson used the video. He pointed to, tried to get the jury to look not at the 9:29, that's the 9 minutes, 29 seconds that the prosecution focused on, but to look at the totality of the video, the 16 minutes, if you will, to show that Derek Chauvin was confronted with something in terms of George Floyd's behavior when he first arrived at the scene, and he reacted accordingly to that. Ultimately, the videos were very compelling evidence. I don't think we can deny that. And I think the prosecution's argument during summation, where they said, believe what you saw, believe what you see. The prosecution was referencing the video, and it was something that you could not escape. You had to deal with on both sides.
You're looking at live images in this special coverage, Fox News special coverage of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, and you're seeing folks gathered outside the courthouse. Some were chanting just before the verdict was announced. It appears some of the folks who have gathered are perhaps expressing a sigh of relief. My colleague, Fox News correspondent Caroline Shively, is there. Caroline, what are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Folks have taken to the street. We were in the grassy area right by the government center. Take a look around. Phil can spin for you. Folks have taken out to the streets. Maybe a couple hundred folks have stopped traffic. You see cars parked. You see a man with the bullhorn. Some folks are yelling some things. They are saying we now need to go to the police department. We need to put pressure on the police. They are very excited over this verdict. Guilty on all three counts is what this crowd had been hoping for. The sentencing won't be for another 8 weeks, but the judge could sentence Derek Chauvin to 40 years in prison. That is exactly what this crowd wants. You hear some honking. Some of these cars are trapped by this crowd.
Quite a scene outside the courthouse in Minneapolis after the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial was announced. Caroline Shively in the middle of the action there. Caroline, do you think a lot of folks there are relieved by the verdict, quite candidly, that a lot of the folks who wanted a conviction were the ones who turned out in the streets there outside the courthouse?
Goddamn right. Yes, absolutely. This crowd is absolutely ecstatic. They say the fight isn't over. You know who also might be relieved, Mike, is the 3,000 National Guard members who've been called up, the local law enforcement, the law enforcement from other states. They have been prepared for the worst. They have been looking for an angry group of protesters. However, this group right now is very happy. This is the verdict they wanted, the best case scenario. Derek Chauvin guilty on count 1, count 2, and count 3. We saw inside. He was immediately taken into custody. His bail was revoked. Just listen to that. Take a look, Mike. You see this crowd? This is exactly what this crowd wanted.
When we noticed stepped up law enforcement presence fencing around the courthouse after what we saw immediately following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last summer, and of course recent violence in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota nearby, where the death of another person in a recent shooting incident. And so a lot of folks turning out, and hopefully will be a peaceful scene for the rest of this afternoon and this evening as folks gathered are honking their horns in reaction to the verdict being announced there. Caroline, you mentioned sentencing in 8 weeks, and so this case is not over. I expect you'll be out there in about 8 weeks or so. There'll be great anticipation that day, I imagine, as well, to see what the former police officer gets in this case.
You're right, Mike. This certainly isn't over. The jury now will have to look to see if there were any aggravating factors existed. That's some of the information that the judge will use, whether to give him the max sentence, 40 years, or perhaps as low as 12 and a half years, because he does have a clean record. So this jury will go back and see, was a child present? Was the victim treated with particular cruelty? If those answers are yes, we could see a sentencing on the higher side. That is certainly what this crowd out here is hoping for. Now, we also must think this is just the local jury that's handling this. A federal grand jury has been meeting to consider federal charges. If convicted there, the sentence could go up to life in prison for Derek Chauvin. But certainly the news of the day is he has been found guilty on all 3 counts. The crowd here is rowdy. The crowd here is happy. The worst thing we've seen so far, though, is just a big old traffic jam as hundreds of people hit the streets of Minneapolis around the Hennepin County Government Center, where this verdict was handed down just moments ago.
Quite a scene outside the courthouse there in Minneapolis. We expect that we will hear plenty of reaction in the hours ahead from both the defense and the prosecution, what worked in the case, what did not work. I know from talking to some folks that some people thought that the charges perhaps should have been more extensive. But when you look at conviction on all 3 counts, Caroline, Clearly, the government found the right charges because the jury agreed with them, right?
Yes, absolutely. And with less than 11 hours of deliberation, they came back guilty on all 3 counts. Another thing that we're hearing out here in the crowd, they're saying their fight isn't over. They are still working for racial justice. One man with a bullhorn just announced, we now need to go to Brooklyn Center. Of course, that is the site where Daunte Wright was shot and killed by a police officer on April 10th. Some of the worst protests we've seen was in Brooklyn Center over the last 8 days. So the crowd here is not finished. They will continue their protesting, their fighting, they're seeking for racial justice. The law enforcement, of course, is out in force. They will also not be resting tonight. The protests that we've seen so far, Mike, are peaceful. That could change on a dime. We have certainly seen that. But right now, just joy in the streets from the folks here.
All right, Caroline Shively, live outside the courthouse. Thank you so much for your time and your live reporting from the scene. Also joining us live now is Fox News correspondent Lauren Blanchard, also in Minneapolis. Lauren, what are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Yeah, we actually have been trying to stop people as they have been kind of walking away from this protest just behind me. And overwhelmingly, there is a sense of relief that they feel they can go forward from this. One man I talked to, a black man with his son, said he just feels like he can go forward today, a new person, that what he was waiting, he knew inside his bones that this was going to be a guilty verdict on all 3 charges, that he can prove to his son that justice system will work for him, something they said they have not felt up until this point. Another man is almost overcome with emotion over what he's feeling today, having heard the guilty verdict on all 3. Really just a lot of emotions. The second the judge read out those verdicts, there was a massive eruption of cheers coming from in here.
Committed to you. First with breaking news and breaking weather. Fox 10 News starts now.